Australia signs an historic security pact with the US and UK, paving the way for our nation to build nuclear-powered submarines. In tonight's special edition of The World, we'll take you through the deal, the implications on security in the region, get the international reaction and the impact on our already troubled relationship with China. It's been described as the most significant defence pact since the ANZUS Treaty of 1951. AUKUS, as it'll be known, builds on our existing alliance with the United States and Britain. But more importantly, it'll allow Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines for the very first time with access to secret US technology. It means Australia is tearing up its $90 billion diesel submarine deal with France. Leaders of the three countries were at pains to say the plan aims to promote peace and security in the Asia and Pacific region, not threaten it. But there's no doubt it's China's strengthening military positioning and growing assertiveness in the region that has propelled this deal forward. Beijing is condemning it as Cold War mentality and ideological prejudice. Tonight, we'll delve further into the submarines themselves and get more analysis and international reaction. But first, here's our defence correspondent Andrew Green on how the day unfolded.
Well, good morning from Australia.
By dawn's early light, a coordinated, dramatic, strategic strike.
A new enhanced trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States.
Leaders across three continents.
I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal. Appreciate it, Mr. Prime Minister.
Unveiling the biggest shift in this country's defence posture in decades.
Australia is one of our oldest friends, a kindred nation, and a fellow democracy and a natural partner.
And one that's been invited to join an exclusive nuclear club.
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia.
A top-secret submarine plan 18 months in the making, driven by fears of a rapidly growing military power in this region.
The relatively benign security environment that Australia has enjoyed over many decades in our region is behind us.
Torpedoing a $90 billion French deal for conventionally powered subs won't come cheap. Australia's already spent billions, but switching to nuclear will be far more expensive and complex.
It's an enormous amount of work we'll be doing in the coming 18 months, Prime Minister.
Paris was only informed last night, but told its former customer the shock decision shows a lack of coherence that France can only note and regret. Labor too was briefed yesterday and is giving qualified support.
That there be no requirement of a domestic civil nuclear industry. There be no acquisition of nuclear weapons. This agreement would be compatible with the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
This is a dangerous move that will make Australia less safe by putting floating Chernobyls in the heart of our major cities.
This is about propulsion. This is not about acquiring nuclear weapons.
Britain and America will help Australia design its new nuclear submarines, with at least 8 to be built in Adelaide. The first of the future fleet is expected to hit the water in the next decade. Before they arrive, more US submarines are likely to be stationed here. Unlocking its nuclear technology secrets is not something the US military machine does lightly. In fact, it's only happened once before, so there can be no turning back once that vault is flung open. Now, more than ever, Australia is tied to this security alliance with all the advantages that brings and the baggage too, in a neighbourhood bristling with tensions and rivalries. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
And as we heard in Andrew's report, today's announcement has not gone down well in France. The country's foreign minister says the scrapping of the $90 billion submarine deal is a betrayal.
C'est vraiment en bon français.
It really is a stab in the back.
We built a relationship of trust with Australia, and this trust was betrayed. I'm angry today with a lot of bitterness about this breach of contract. This is not done between allies, especially when there's been 2 years of negotiations for this contract. We have an intergovernmental agreement that has been signed with all pomp and circumstance in 2019, with precise commitments and articles in this agreement. So we'll see how they get out of this. This is not the end of the story.
Not the end of the story. Well, let's go to our Europe correspondent, Steve Kinane, who joins us live out of London. Steve, the French are certainly not happy with this development. What sort of recourse do they have?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what the recourse will be at the moment. I'm assuming that they could somehow claim breach of contract. I think we'll find that out in the coming weeks and months. But you could hear the white-hot anger from Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French foreign minister, who himself is a former defence minister, so he knows this territory very well. They are angry for a number of different reasons. And if you look at it from their perspective, they've just had an ally, Australia, tear up a $90 billion contract. They see it that another ally, the US, has played an active role in undercutting that deal. And then they see another ally and long-term rival as well, Britain, is going to profit from it. There is that sense of betrayal. The French foreign minister said that he had spoken to his Australian counterpart in recent days and there was no mention of this contract being torn up. I think you've also got a loss of face going on here. There's been a lot of disputes and delays and blowouts around this build of these submarines in France, so it's embarrassing for the French government. And Bev, throw a dose of politics in there as well. Early next year, we're going to have a French presidential election. Emmanuel Macron will be running again, and one of his key rivals will be Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is popular with blue-collar voters. She's an old-school protectionist. She pitches for these kind of jobs in the manufacturing industry as being very important for France, and I am sure that she will be making hay out of the fact that Emmanuel Macron has not been able to keep this contract. And if you think of that anger that we heard from the French foreign minister before, a lot of it is directed at the US. And in fact, in that radio interview, he compared President Biden with former President Trump. I'll read a quote to you, Bev. He said, "This brutal, unilateral, unpredictable decision looks very much like what Mr. Trump used to do. Allies don't do this to each other. It's rather insufferable."
Interesting indeed. And Steve, the UK Prime Minister has been taking questions on this morning in Parliament. How's he positioning the deal?
Well, he's selling it very much as something that is in the strategic interests of Britain. He says that Australia and the US and the UK all have shared interests and that this alliance will help protect those interests. And specifically, what he's talking about is Britain's renewed focus on the Indo-Pacific region. He says he described it as being becoming part of the geopolitical centre of the world and therefore very important for British trade interests. And he sees this as something that will protect trade and therefore jobs and livelihoods in the UK. Here's what he said in the UK House of Commons just a couple of hours ago.
While our partnership will begin with nuclear power submarines, now that we have created AUKUS, we expect to accelerate the development of other advanced defence systems, including in cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and undersea capabilities. It will help to safeguard the security of the Indo-Pacific, create jobs at home, and reinforce our country's place at the leading edge of technology.
Now, Bev, I know you know that there's a lot of dissent in the House of Commons, but on this issue there seemed to be broad support. Both Labor and the Liberal Democrats said they supported Boris Johnson and the UK government in this move. And that's what Boris Johnson was saying just a couple of hours ago in the Commons. Great to talk, Steve. Thanks so much. Steve Kinane there in our London bureau. Well, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has heralded the deal as a forever partnership between Australia's oldest and most trusted friends. The bold strategic move is likely to trigger further tensions with our largest trading partner, China. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
One single momentous decision reconfigures Australia's relationship between its oldest ally, Britain, its key security partner, the United States, and its biggest customer, China. Beijing has no doubt where Australia's allegiances lie, but by embracing US-British nuclear submarine technology, Australia entrenches its role as a regional foil against China's assertiveness.
It is not an uncommon thing for countries to take decisions in their own strategic interests and to build up their defence capabilities.
The fact the Prime Minister would risk offending the French by tearing up a $90 billion contract shows you how much the government believes the security environment's changed in just a few years. That June meeting in Cornwall between Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden was when this deal was forged. Turns out it might have been one of the most consequential meetings in recent times.
A forever partnership for a new time between the oldest and most trusted of friends.
Will the so-called AUKUS agreement inflame tensions with China? You bet.
US, UK and Australia are engaging in cooperation that gravely undermines regional peace and stability.
It'll see Australian and British submarines become a structural part of America's Indo-Pacific pivot to push back at President Xi Jinping's military play. But this audacious realignment has its hurdles, even with friends who don't like nuclear warships coming portside.
No vessel that is wholly or fully, partially or fully powered by nuclear energy is able to enter into our internal waters.
The PM wants Jacinda Ardern on side, if anything, to reassure regional neighbours nervy about Washington's wrestle with Beijing. Morrison's nuclear option set to be sealed next week alongside his British counterpart on a visit to the US.
Well, Jeff Bleich is the former US ambassador to Australia. He says the trilateral security partnership is not just about countering China.
Clearly, the focus is on ensuring free navigation. And so one of the issues that's arisen over the years has been China's desire to maintain exclusive control over what it refers to as South China Sea, and also its belligerence at times with respect to sea lanes. So China's clearly part of it, but they're not the only part of it. You know, the Straits of Malacca are a critical, trade path for our nations, and there have been other countries in the region that can also create mischief there. So it's clearly China's part of it, but it's not the whole story.
Well, let's try and learn some more about nuclear-powered submarines. How do they work? What are some of the pros and cons? Yvonne Yong took a look.
One thing to be clear about is that a nuclear-powered submarine is not a nuclear weapon, and Australia says its subs will not be armed with nuclear weapons. Weapons-grade uranium is 90% enriched or more. When we say enriched, that means increasing the proportion of the isotope uranium-235 in it. Uranium fuel for a nuclear-powered sub is enriched to 20% or more. But the vessels do draw power from mini nuclear reactors on board. Now, these produce energy by splitting atoms to create heat and, in turn, steam for turbines that generate electricity. So why would you go nuclear over a diesel-electric powered submarine? Firstly, they don't need to be refuelled and they don't need to come up for air and can therefore stay underwater for longer. Endurance. Whereas diesel-powered ones need to resurface regularly for oxygen and to charge their batteries. Nuclear-powered submarines are also faster, but they're a lot more expensive and larger, therefore less nimble. You do have to think about the safe disposal of the spent uranium as well, not to mention the risk of nuclear accidents. Now, 6 countries already have nuclear submarines: China, France, India, Russia, the UK and the US. China has 6 as well as 50 diesel-electric ones, but unlike these other nations, Australia does not have a nuclear industry capable of supporting the submarines. Reactor modules will need to be delivered to Australia when they would be installed in the subs.
Alexei Muravyev is an Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University in Perth, and he is with us now. Alexei, really good to talk. Let's talk about how going nuclear is going to better equip us going into the future.
Well, I mean, from the military strategic perspective, it provides the Australian Defence Force, or will provide the Australian Defence Force with further reach. We would be able to survey our maritime approaches at a greater distance, and we would be able to engage strategic targets with greater degree of lethality. I mean, as it was mentioned, nuclear-powered submarines can accommodate a far greater array of weaponry on board. They can spend and see greater deal of time. And more importantly, the very fact that an adversary will be confronted with a nuclear-powered submarine force is a sufficient enough deterrent. So that certainly provides enormous benefits to the enabler, to the user, but we also need to understand the consequences of making such a decision, whether they would be political, military, or otherwise.
Yes, so we want to talk about that more in a moment. But let's just talk about the proposition of nuclear propulsion. Scott Morrison says that's all it is. It's only about how these submarines are going to be powered. Is that all it'll be, though?
Look, I mean, at this point in time, the government would obviously want to commit to just nuclear propulsion. So by giving the Navy the platform it always wanted and required. But look, I mean, let's be frank. Nuclear-powered capability, and certainly the submarines operated by both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy have a great degree of interoperability. They carry similar systems. They carry same weapon systems, both conventional and unconventional. And down the track, because we're not getting them tomorrow, we're getting them after a long period of, first of all, design, consultation, then design, then the production, then sea trials. It may take up to 10 years for the first boat to be put to water and made fully operational. And if the operational environment or there is going to be operational requirement, well, who is going to guarantee that our subs will not be armed with weapons supplied by our either British or American allies? And again, this is going to be a requirement for the Navy on needs basis rather than us formally committing to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
And so if say, the US was using one of our submarines to carry nuclear weapons, would we be in breach of the treaties that we have signed up to?
Well, this is what lawyers have to basically worry about. I mean, whether we going to have the capability to store them on land, and if we're going to have enhanced commitment with our enhanced security and defense commitments, and we're going to effectively upgrade our naval defense facilities to accommodate a fleet of nuclear powered vessels, we obviously have to have appropriate storage facilities for spares, lubricants, all the parts that will keep them going and operational. I won't rule out completely that there is not going to be special storage facilities capable of accommodating special munitions and special devices. Whether it's going to be a breach or a legal breach or not, well, look, I mean, this is what the legal experts have to look into, because once the submarine is at sea, it's away from the Australian territory. Yes, technically it's an extension of the Australian territory, but I think there would be clauses under which you can actually make an argument.
All right, let's talk about the impact with our foreign policies. Is this deal worth further alienating China over?
Look, I think we need to be very clear. Are we doing this because we want to enhance our security? And obviously, the sovereignty and the very survival of our nation is very much depends on uninterrupted access to the sea. For us to be able to carry and maintain a favorable maritime security regime. If this is the primary objective, yes, then it's a really good and a smart deal. With regards to containing China, well, yes, it's not going to be a pleasant surprise for Beijing, and I think they will be making very clear, and they have already made some expected sounds about this. Should this deter China from expanding its strategic reach into our part of the world? Should it deter China from acquiring more of its ocean-going capability? Well, to some extent, it would probably provoke a regional naval arms race, including a nuclear-powered submarine race, which will not only be limited to China, but again, this is something I keep bringing up. We need to also be mindful of the Russian Navy that operates a potent submarine force, and in the process of upgrading it with respect to its operations in the Pacific. So I think there's going to be, and we should be anticipating a trigger response from our potential adversaries, but also some sort of a political response from a broader in the Asia-Pacific community, including from our neighbors who would also be quite anxious, if not nervous, to find out what is the true intent behind acquiring such a stealthy and deadly capability.
Alexei, the EU tonight has come out and said that this is also a serious blow in terms of their own strategic thinking going into the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we didn't really give the French much notice. The French could have probably provided us with nuclear submarines. How critical is this? How much of a blow is it going to be to other groupings and their efforts to contain China in this region?
Look, I mean, if the EU will look at this as a blow to its posturing or its interest in the Asia Pacific, well, we need to ask Brussels a question on which side they're on. I mean, I would look at the EU as our strategic partner, as our friend, and there are obviously a number of core nations, including France, which Australia has special security, defense, as well as trade relations. Yes, it's a nasty surprise to the French, but on the other hand, business is business, and national security is a very serious business. I mean, what was promised to us when the agreement was signed at the cost of $50 billion is now turned to be something that less of a promise, but with a higher cost of almost $90 billion, and that, as far as I understand, wasn't the final price. There were also delays with expected arrival of the first platforms, and it would still be not something that would be super ideal, that the Navy would ideally wanted to acquire, because the discussion about Australia acquiring a nuclear-powered attack submarine capability was in the works for quite some time, and it was the politicians who didn't have the courage of effectively making the decision that would be in Australia's best interest here. So again, just like with our regional neighbors, just like with even our potential adversaries, that would require some careful politicking, that would require some explanation, but that what really comes with all such brave and bold decisions, that you obviously have to understand the fallout on both on the other side as well as among our friends.
Yeah. Alexei, really great to get your perspective on this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, the decision to scrap the $90 billion French submarine deal has left hundreds of workers in limbo. Questions have also been raised about future jobs in the supply chain supporting the project. The choice of a nuclear-powered vessel has also drawn a mixed reaction.
Hi. Last week, apprentice Nathan McDonald was preparing for a long career welding together French submarines.
Well, I always wanted to do something like this when I was younger, and now I've got the opportunity.
Now that's been halted. The decision to scrap Naval Group's $90 billion deal with the Commonwealth creates uncertainty for the company's 350-strong Australian workforce.
I'm not really sure how to react at the moment.
They are needed, they are wanted, and we will support them into new jobs.
There are also questions about jobs in the submarine supply chain. Local firms were promised 60% of work on the French subs, a guarantee now less clear on the nuclear-powered project.
We know that build can mean many different things, and we expect to see that unfold in the coming months.
Another 400 construction jobs on the Adelaide shipyard will also disappear, but positions will be created when work begins on the new subs years later than the French build was to start. In between, the Osborne shipyard in Adelaide's northwestern suburbs will continue servicing the current Collins-class fleet to refit it to extend its life, ending years of speculation that work could shift to Perth.
Our expectation is to see some 5,000 South Australians employed in the naval shipbuilding industries by 2030.
Some who live near the shipyard are stunned a nuclear-powered sub will be built in the neighbourhood.
I'm just in shock, really. I just can't believe that they're going to do that. Why?
And it's a proven technology now, and I'm happy to advocate that I'm pro-nuclear.
Nevertheless, it's a big shift for a country with decades of anti-nuclear sentiment and a state which only 5 years ago rejected a Royal Commission recommendation to consider storing the world's nuclear waste.
Well, I think for any government it's going to take some time. I think it's the perfect time. The catalyst is the changed circumstances. It's now about explaining what this capability brings to Australia.
Capability the military says the country now needs. Rory McLaren, ABC News, Adelaide.
So just what are the implications of having nuclear submarines based here, and will it lead to a bigger nuclear industry? Let's go to Maria Rost-Rubley. She's a nuclear expert from Monash University and has previously worked in intelligence for the United States government. Maria, really good to get you on the program. What are the immediate questions raised for you today, given this deal was announced with great fanfare, but really very little detail behind it?
Yes, well, there are lots of questions, but related to the nuclear component of the submarine deal, the first question that immediately comes to my mind and the mind of experts in the region is, who is going to supply the nuclear fuel that is going to power these subs? This is actually a really critical question. There's been a lot of fanfare about how Australia will not have nuclear weapons. These submarines will not carry nuclear weapons. But there still is the question, will Australia be creating the highly enriched uranium that's going to propel these nuclear submarines? And if so, that's going to cause diplomatic, treaty-related, environmental, social, health, political issues, a very large number of them, not to mention make regional allies and adversaries very nervous. If, on the other hand, the U.S. is going to be supplying this highly enriched uranium, a very dangerous nuclear substance, then that alleviates some of the concerns, but not all of them.
Yeah. So if the US were to provide that enriched uranium to us for the propulsion of these submarines, how would it work?
Well, basically, it's as though we had a nuclear power plant, and this happens all around the world. Most countries with nuclear power don't actually create their own enriched fuel for it. Instead, they get fuel rods. In our case, we would get fuel rods for the mini nuclear power plant inside the submarines. And in the case of nuclear submarines, the way the U.S. designs them, they're designed to be fueled only once, so we don't have to worry about refueling accidents. And so they're just delivered to Australia as part of the mini nuclear power plant. However, that doesn't mitigate all the risks. There can be, what about when the nuclear sub is in dry dock? How is that handled? Where will they be held? What if there are accidents while they're at sea in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? We have to remember that Australia does not have a nuclear industry. I mean, we do have ANSTO, some of the world-leading experts in terms of medical and nuclear-related civilian research, but nothing related to military applications. There's no depth here. And so how do we expect to have Australians running nuclear subs handling this very dangerous material, not to mention the risks of potential accidents, which is relatively low given that the U.S. designs are pretty safe, but you never can tell, especially when you have people who haven't been trained on these types of materials their entire lives the way they have in the U.S.
And so, Maria, how hard is it going to be to pivot then the industry in Adelaide from, the type of submarines they've been building to these nuclear submarines? And to your point, is it not time that Australia developed this knowledge?
Well, it will be a big pivot. The U.S. design is very, very different from the French design. Not just that in terms of it was non-nuclear, it was a conventional propelled rather than nuclear propelled, but the U.S. design there are a lot of differences. So basically, a lot of the work is going to have to be scrapped and redone. Of course, we have the gap between people that were actually working on it right now, and they're not going to, be working on the U.S. nuclear subs for at least a couple of years. And so where do these people work? How do we keep people employed who have expertise? In terms of creating the type of training that we need in Australia, absolutely. And in fact, the nuclear industry has been talking about this for a while. My understanding, there's only one nuclear engineering course in the entire country. And it was even hard to get that started up, and there are only a handful of students in it. So, there are so many issues related to this, sudden announcement, not the least of which are things like practical questions, HR questions, education type questions. How are we going to have enough people, submariners, construction workers, people who can handle the submarines while they're in dry dock, et cetera. There's a lot of complications. And my concern, the concern of a lot of people, is that these haven't been sorted through, that it's just, oh, we have this warm glow, the U.S. sharing this sensitive technology with us. We're just happy to be part of that, without understanding exactly what we're committing to and whether or not we have the national capacity to actually pull it off.
Yeah, there was this sort of kind of sense of naivety which a lot of analysts have commented on. Do you think there was a simpler option for us to partner with the US and the UK in this region, given we know that there are great concerns about China's increased aggression in the region?
Yes, well, there are a lot of options other than nuclear powered subs. And certainly, people have been saying that the one good thing about this is that we've gotten out of the deal with the French, which really I was a critic of, and many other people were critic of, for a number of reasons, not the least of which the cost was too much to begin with, and then has almost doubled, and probably would have gone further. But for example, South Korea has just done a 30-month intense examination, and they're using, electric submarines. They've decided that's what will work for them. I'm not saying that would necessarily be what would work best for Australia. There's good reason to think about nuclear-powered submarines because Australia has a huge maritime space to consider. But there are also significant disadvantages of nuclear submarines, which don't seem to be considered at all in this debate.
Yeah. And just finally, Maria, there's often been a debate in Australia about whether we should enrich uranium. We have uranium. We could be enriching it and selling it. Do you think that would be too tricky a discussion and a debate to now have?
Well, yes, this debate has come up multiple times. For example, with the most recent Royal Commission in South Australia on this, whether or not nuclear waste should be taken and you can reprocess it and take out useful nuclear material and then resell it. And the analysis was that it actually doesn't make economic sense right now because the uranium doesn't sell for that much, because a lot of decommissioned nuclear weapons, the nuclear fuel, is then used for civilian purposes. But there's a larger issue here. There are very few countries in the world that enrich uranium. If you can enrich uranium for a power plant or for a nuclear submarine, you use the exact same equipment to enrich it for nuclear weapons. And so countries in the region would be shocked and startled if Australia said, we're going to be enriching uranium. The US, in fact, has led an effort against the highly enriched uranium remaining in sites around the world and against countries trying to get enrichment technology. And so, for example, South Korea has been arguing, why can't we enrich uranium? We depend heavily on nuclear power, and the US has really pressured against that, and in fact was able to talk South Korea out of sort of demanding that. Yeah. And so it's a political hot button. It would regionally and globally have all sorts of repercussions. It's not just a matter of sort of domestic Australian interests.
Yeah. Really great to chat to you tonight, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, let's get to the day's other news. And Premier Daniel Andrews has urged Victorians to comply with new lockdown rules when limited outdoor gatherings are allowed this weekend. The COVID rules in Melbourne and Ballarat will be relaxed just marginally after more than 70% of eligible Victorians have had at least one COVID vaccine dose. Gatherings of up to 5 people from 2 households will be allowed outdoors, but only for the fully vaccinated. Here's Bridget Rollison.
Today's spring weather provided perfect conditions for a picnic. These empty tables are likely to be full this weekend.
Well overdue, we can't wait for it.
I've got a few friends lined up for a picnic.
That's incredible because we haven't seen our grandson for 3 months, so we'll plan to see him on Sunday.
Victorians will be rewarded for hitting the 70% single dose target, despite the daily case numbers passing 500 for the first time in 13 months.
There are 5 reasons to leave the home at the moment. There will, from midnight tomorrow night, be a 6th.
People in Melbourne and Ballarat will be able to meet with one other person outside for a picnic. But if you're fully vaccinated, you can socialise outdoors in groups of 5 from 2 households.
We are not going to have police in every park. We're not going to have police out there requiring people to prove that they've been vaccinated. There's a degree of good faith in this. I'm asking people to do the right thing.
The exercise limit will also double from 2 hours to 4, and the 5-kilometre travel restriction will be increased to 10. But the curfew remains.
These are modest. We've never tried to oversell them, but they're not unimportant. They are meaningful.
While most of today's cases were again in Melbourne's north and west, authorities are concerned about a growing number of infections in the city's southeast, including in Dandenong, Keysborough and Clyde North.
We're starting to see some seeding out now, particularly from essential workers moving across the city, moving from the north and west into the southeast.
Sunday's the day Victorians will get a roadmap for what the next few months will look like. But the Australian Medical Association says it'd be reckless to lift the current lockdown before 80% of Victorians over 12 are vaccinated, which could be mid-November.
We need to do everything safely, sensibly, with a sophisticated approach.
The AMA have a view, and they're not wrong.
But the Premier says he'll be sticking to the national plan. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne. Well, New South Wales has now recorded more than 200 COVID-related deaths since the Delta outbreak began in June. 12 people died in the latest reporting period. Today, the state recorded 1,351 new infections, and there's good news and bad news for parts of regional New South Wales. Stay-at-home orders in 12 areas have been lifted, but 2 other LGAs are tonight back in lockdown. Here's Leah White.
Barely out of lockdown, Lismore businesses have been plunged straight back in.
We're fully stocked with a full cool room of fresh produce, which we don't know what we're going to do with now, to be honest with you.
Lismore has 1 confirmed case and Albury 2, sparking snap lockdowns in both areas.
Health has determined that 7 days will be appropriate, but I'm just warning the community that it may be longer.
A confirmed case attended a public school in the Lismore area on Monday. Several shops have been listed as casual contact sites. Health authorities say the infection was acquired in Sydney.
A parent that returned back to Lismore with their child, it was an exposure in the school environment as well, so that there is issues there.
At the opposite end of the state, one of the Albury cases is isolating in provided accommodation. The other is a man transferred from Mildura in northwest Victoria.
He's in ICU, he's been cared for. I understand he's not on a ventilator at the moment.
Among the exposure sites is a train that left Sydney on Sunday. Local businesses were still getting used to being open again after coming out of the statewide lockdown.
We offer a lot of personal styling in our shop and that real conversation face-to-face. So that's something we really rely on as a business.
I guess it was inevitable that it would happen, but very disappointing. Let's hope it's only for a week.
There was some good news though, with 12 local government areas, including the Bega Valley, Snowy Monero, Singleton and Narrabri, all coming out of lockdown.
Super excited, but also super nervous because I thought we would have had a day or two to prepare, not be open straight away.
But back in Lismore, employers like Steve Krieg are having to tell their staff they won't be required.
It really takes a lot out of you emotionally.
Just another day on the pandemic's regional roller coaster ride. Leah White, ABC News, Lismore.
And 13 new local cases have been recorded in New Zealand as the country hits a vaccination milestone. The latest infections take the outbreak total to 996. 460 people have recovered. 3 million first doses of the vaccine have been delivered nationwide. That means 70% of the eligible population is at least partially vaccinated. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is calling on people to come forward.
With the ability to get to 80% of Aucklanders vaccinated with their first dose by the end of the week. Nearly 37,000 first doses were delivered in Auckland in the last 2 days, but we need to do even better again. For those of you who are yet to get that first vaccine, I encourage you to get out there and to do it today.
Well, today marks 46 years since Papua New Guinea achieved independence, but with COVID infections on the rise in recent weeks, health authorities are concerned today's celebrations may lead to yet another spike. Our PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting says while the public was encouraged to take precautions, most took little to no notice.
We have seen thousands of people coming together today to celebrate PNG's 46th Independence Day anniversary from when they gained independence from Australia. Now, look, that isn't surprising, despite the concerns that these mass gatherings could spread COVID-19. None of the events were cancelled. So despite the concerns from health authorities, we expected to see people gather. We did. Health authorities were urging people to wear masks, to try to socially distance as much as possible. There were some people in masks, but unfortunately quite a few who weren't wearing them.
So what are we seeing in terms of COVID cases, though, in the country as to what that might do?
Well, we have been seeing a recent rise in cases, which is why health authorities were particularly concerned. So people may remember that we had the big surge in PNG, particularly here in the capital, Port Moresby, from about March to May of this year. We then saw the case numbers subside, but in the last few weeks we've seen them rising again. And authorities are largely putting that down to the Delta variant. It has been confirmed in the country. We've seen it coming across from Indonesia. And so that is the big concern, that in the last few weeks we've seen case numbers start to rise again, and we know that there is Delta spreading in the community.
And where are the areas of the most concern?
Well, it is along that land border with Indonesia, which isn't surprising. People obviously will have seen that we've had big outbreaks in Indonesia, including in the provinces of Papua and West Papua. So we've seen the Delta variant come across the border there. So we're seeing surges now in the two PNG provinces of Western and West Sepik. We're seeing big surges there. Local hospitals are feeling the pressure. There's several COVID isolation wards along that area that are full, including on the island of Daru, which is in the Torres Strait, just alongside the Australian border. The Daru hospital has been experiencing a rise in cases, and they've also had one of their doctors who's in quite a serious condition having to be medevaced here to the capital. So the health authorities are quite concerned that the surges we're seeing along the border, we could see spread further across the country. Here's a little of what they've had to say.
If the country is not careful, we might have a severe surge and a massive outbreak that can easily get out of control, and we're going to have a lot of people dying.
Of course, critical to this, Nat, is the vaccine rollout. How is that going?
Yes, look, unfortunately, the vaccine rollout isn't happening very quickly here in PNG. We've seen about just short of 120,000 people have had at least one dose of a vaccine, and about 45,000 who have had both doses and are fully vaccinated. Those are very low figures for a country that is thought to have between 8 to 10 million people. So there's a lot of concern around the vaccine uptake. And unfortunately, it's not an issue of availability, but of convincing people to take the vaccines. We did actually see back in July almost 12,000 doses had to be destroyed of the AstraZeneca when they reached expiry. And authorities here have actually just sent 30,000 AstraZeneca doses to Vietnam in the last few weeks to prevent them from expiring, to make sure they could be used. So there's a lot of work to be done here in increasing education and awareness and trying to reassure people amid a lot of conspiracy theories that the vaccines are safe and that people should take them to protect themselves and their communities.
Yeah, quite a difficult task. Great to talk. Thanks, Natalie. An Indonesian court has found the country's President Joko Widodo and several other government officials guilty of environmental negligence for failing to tackle air pollution. The citizen lawsuit was filed in 2019 against the president, several government ministers and other prominent local leaders. The plaintiffs say the lawsuit was a last-ditch attempt to compel authorities to take action against severe air pollution in Jakarta's bustling metropolis. The court found the President, Widodo and 6 other officials had neglected their citizens' rights to clean air and ordered them to improve the air quality in the capital. The family of an Australian woman killed by a former US police officer say they are heartbroken at a court decision to overturn his murder conviction. Mohammed Noor shot Justine Diamond Ruszczyk dead after she reported a possible rape near her Minneapolis home in 2017. With time already served, he could be on parole before Christmas. Here's crime reporter Mark Reddy.
An ex-Minneapolis police officer could soon be out of jail.
It was big news in the United States, a decision that has inflicted more suffering on a family that has lost so much. 2 years ago, former police officer Mohammed Noor was jailed for 12.5 years for murdering Justine Diamond Ruszczyk in Minneapolis.
We're satisfied that he's received the maximum penalty under law, and for that we're grateful.
But not anymore.
The court has overturned Noor's third-degree murder conviction in the death of Justine Diamond in 2017.
Ruling there was insufficient evidence to find the killing was targeted or intentional. Now it truly feels like there's been no justice for Justine.
In no way, shape or form is this a big victory for Noor's team.
In the lead up to her death, Ms. Diamond Ruszczyk called 911 to report a potential rape near her home. When she approached a police car, Noor fired his gun. And while not convicted of murder anymore, he will now be sentenced for manslaughter.
When it goes back to the judge, I'm quite confident that the sentence very well could be the max for second-degree manslaughter, which is 10 years.
On the lower end, it could be 4 years, meaning with time already served, Noor could be eligible for parole by the end of the year. Ms. Diamond Ruszczyk grew up here on Sydney's northern beaches. In a statement, her family is calling on Noor to be sentenced fairly but harshly, in a manner that reflects a loss her loved ones continue to endure. Mark Reddy, ABC News.
2 men have been extradited from Dubai to Sydney after they allegedly help import nearly 3 tonnes of drugs into Australia. Police say it's the culmination of an 8-year investigation into a transnational crime syndicate linked to the Lone Wolf Bikie Club. The group was allegedly trafficking MDMA and ice. Matthew Battar and Benjamin Pitt arrived last night during a secret extradition operation. Police allege they fled overseas as pressure from investigators intensified.
These guys are at the top of the food chain. They were involved in the syndicate components controlling the imports from Africa and Europe. They are key players. Obviously, they had significant wealth.
28 others were arrested during the investigation. The Tamil family seeking asylum in Australia will be allowed to stay for a further 3 months after the Immigration Minister issued an extension to their bridging visas. The Murahapans have been fighting deportation since they were first removed from Biloela in central Queensland in 2018. The High Court last month refused a special leave request for 4-year-old Tarnika, who was seeking a chance to apply for a protection visa. In a hearing in the Federal Circuit and Family Court, the government barrister said the family will continue to work and study in Perth. Olympic gymnast Simone Biles has given emotional testimony at a US Senate hearing about her abuse at the hands of former team doctor Larry Nassar. Nassar is serving a life sentence accused of sexually abusing hundreds of girls, including Biles and fellow gymnasts Michaela Maroney and Ali Raisman. They claim the FBI covered up evidence and say USA Gymnastics and the US Olympic Committee enabled the abuse to continue in the months after Nassar was reported.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse. USA Gymnastics and the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee knew that I was abused by their official team doctor long before I was ever made aware of their knowledge.
This was very clear, cookie-cutter pedophilia and abuse. And this is important because I told the FBI all of this, and they chose to falsify my report and to not only minimize my abuse, but silence me yet again. I thought, given the severity of this situation, that they would act quickly for the sake of protecting other girls. But instead, it took them 14 months to report anything when Larry Nassar, in my opinion, should have been in jail that day.
Why are we left to guess why USAG and USOPC deliberately ignored reported abuse? Was it to protect the value of the sponsorships? The LA 28 bid? Their own jobs? To avoid criminal liability? Perhaps. But why must we speculate when the facts are obtainable and the stakes are so high?
The first space flight crewed only by civilians has taken off. It's the first mission of its kind and the brainchild of business magnate Elon Musk. The SpaceX Inspiration 4 mission took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. Aboard the Dragon crew capsule are 4 civilians led by a billionaire businessman who paid for the entire trip, plus 2 women and another man. All 4 underwent months of intensive training before liftoff. The crew will spend the next 3 days orbiting the planet. Rwanda's endangered grey-crowned crane population has almost doubled in the past 4 years thanks to the efforts of a conservationist. The majestic creatures' numbers have been steadily declining over the past decade with a loss of their natural habitat, poaching practices and the illegal pet trade. The population has now recovered from fewer than 500 mature birds to almost 900, but is still an estimated 80% loss. Grey-crowned cranes are considered one of Africa's most striking bird species. And an endangered walrus has been spotted in North Germany for the first time in more than 20 years. The female travelled hundreds of kilometres from its usual Arctic habitat. Authorities believe melting ice in the region played a role. The last time a walrus was spotted in the area was back in 1998, and many locals are absolutely delighted to have the chance to see one of Europe's largest sea mammals close up. Well, it took just minutes for the final tickets to this year's AFL Grand Final to Perth Stadium to sell out. With just over 10,000 on offer, there were 200,000 footy lovers logged on to buy seats. Most, of course, left empty-handed. Here's Tom Wilde.
10,000 tickets sold in less than 10 minutes.
I gather there was 180,000 people in the queue, which is, I know definitively, an Australian record.
With Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs taking their full membership allocations earlier this week, it means the match is a sellout. But with 9 days before bounce down, the AFL is taking a conservative approach in the build-up, leaving nothing to chance when it comes to COVID. That includes the Brownlow Medal night on Sunday, keeping the Demons and Bulldogs players in separate rooms from the other 800 expected attendees.
We know we're in Perth and the police and the West Australian government, everyone's doing their bit. There's risk every day. We'll deal with it if it comes up. But what we do is just continue to have a mindset where we play the percentages.
The Western Bulldogs continue their preparations, confident 2 key players will return in time for the grand final. Defender Alex Keith missed the 71-point preliminary final victory over Port Adelaide with a hamstring injury, while forward Latham Vandermeer was subbed out of the same game, also with hamstring concerns.
After full assessment that he's copped a knock in his glute and he's had some referred pain.
Small forward Cody Waitman is right to play after recovering from concussion. While the immediate focus is on next week's decider, the AFL's football department has undergone some structural change ahead of next year. Former North Melbourne coach Brad Scott and Kangaroos football operations manager Laura Kane joining the organisation. Scott will manage the competition's governance, including the match review officer and tribunal, while Kane will oversee all AFL-run competitions and COVID management.
I think the challenges are going to be around making sure that we transition with, say, vaccination rates through to logistical complexities like border closures.
It also means Scott is out of the running for the vacant Carlton coaching job. Tom Wilde, ABC News.
Swimmer Shayna Jack is now free to return to the sport after an appeal lodged against her was dismissed. Jack was suspended for 2 years after testing positive to the banned substance Lagandrol in 2019. The World Anti-Doping Agency and Sport Integrity Australia had appealed the leniency of the ban. The original hearing found Jack didn't intentionally take the substance. The Court of Arbitration for Sport dismissed the appeal, meaning Jack's battle with the anti-doping authorities is over. Let's get the weather. Here's Graham Creed.
We got some very strong and gusty winds developing through South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. Severe weather warnings are in place in many parts of Victoria, extending from the southwest all the way through into the northeast of the state and also into the alpine areas of New South Wales. Now, with those strong and gusty winds, some raised dust in South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. We'll also see along this trough the potential of some thunderstorms. These could trigger some very strong and gusty conditions as well. We'll also start to see showers increasing through that southeast corner. Elsewhere, mostly dry, although there could be the odd thunderstorm through central parts of the continent. In the southwest, though, still plenty of coastal showers, although a little bit of frost over the southern inland.
Our top story again tonight. Australia signs an historic security pact with the US and UK and tears up its $90 billion submarine deal with France. The security partnership, AUKUS, builds on our existing alliance with the US and Britain. It will also allow Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines for the very first time with access to secret US technology. And that is your shape. Not your shape, your world for tonight. You can find more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. I better get out of here. Bye-bye.